Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. In this episode, the All Stars are back. Ben Smithwick, PRI's Vice President of Development, California Fellow Carrie Jackson, and with me as always, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications. We're here on this special podcast to provide our listeners with a PRI election preview. So without further ado, and this is going to be a little bit longer podcast, so you might want to pour yourself a glass of wine or have a cocktail. Thanks for joining us. Well, welcome, gentlemen. Before we get into the ballot measures and the candidates, let's start with a big picture question. How would each of you characterize this campaign season? So, Tim, you're a veteran staffer of the legislature and in the thick of almost 2 decades of campaigns in the state. What's your take? Less contentious, given that the Democratic Party dominates the state, or perhaps loonier than ever?
I think I would characterize this election in 2 words: money tsunami. Democrats have always had a financial advantage in the California races, but it's been off the charts this year. You know, if you look at the races for the House of Representatives, it used to be rare that an incumbent would be outraised by their challengers. Well, not this year. You know, the GOP candidates in the competitive races in California are being outraised and outspent in some cases by a margin of 5-1. And that's not including the outside money from the various super PAC. If you look at Congressman Dana Rohrabacher's race, for example, he's been the target of $10 million in attack ads, and it's getting even worse. Michael Bloomberg just dropped $8.5 million in negative ads in 2 congressional districts in California, in Dana Rohrabacher's race and the race of Congressman Steve Knight. So it's just pretty wild to see this. Now, the legislative races may not be getting as much attention, but I think they're just as contentious as the congressional races. Now, most GOP incumbents are outraising their Democratic challengers, but Democrats are on the offense in seats that they've never seriously contested before. So it's going to be very interesting to see how those shake out. Now, the loony bit is the result of our wacky top 2 primary system, where we have same party general election contest. So you have Kevin De Leon hitting Dianne Feinstein because she's not true enough of a progressive. And if you look at that objectively, that's just nutty. If you think Dianne Feinstein isn't liberal enough, I would dare say there's something wrong with you. You know, and then you see in the Assembly, in District 15, which is in Berkeley, you're having a Bernie Sanders-style Democratic socialist running to the left of one of Barack Obama's top campaign aides and community organizers. And it begs the question, how could you be more left-wing than an Obama community organizer? It is definitely a wild year. I don't know about contentious is the right word, but it's definitely a wild and in some cases loony election season.
So, Carrie, before joining PRI, you were a longtime editorial writer for the Investor's Business Daily. What do you think about the media coverage during this campaign season? Can candidates and issues get coverage even if they don't mention the T word, Donald Trump?
The media is the most biased I have ever seen it, ever, going back as long as I've been keeping up with elections and current events, and that's going back quite some way. And the bias is open, it's outright, and it's as if all but Fox and a few other outlets are essentially a wing of the Democratic Party. So, yeah, it's hard to get fair coverage on issues. And as far as really looking at issues, the media has just stopped looking at these things, I think, for the most part, unless they find something that they want to latch onto, which is pretty rare. But they're focused instead on the coolness factor of candidates. And I think the best example of this is not the only example. The best example of this is Beto O'Rourke in Texas, in that Texas race. They have just been slobbering over this fellow. I don't think has any achievements. He has been in the House for a while, but they found him as a cool guy. And I think the media has been looking for another Camelot ever since the original Camelot died with Kennedy in '63. They didn't get it with Carter. They tried, Humphrey was not a good candidate for them either. And they tried with Clinton. And that's what they're always looking for. They tried with Obama too. So It's not about issues with them. It's not about covering things that people, I think, should be interested in. It's about perceptions.
Carrie, now that you mentioned that, he does look like a Kennedy. So, Ben, you're originally from Connecticut. What do you think about our politics out here in the Wild West?
I think there are certainly a lot of similarities between the two states. To mention the T word, President Trump, he has a low approval rating, obviously, in both California and Connecticut. Although it's interesting that Connecticut's current governor, Malloy, actually has a lower approval rating than President Trump. And I think in Connecticut, people are worried about the economy, businesses leaving the state. But despite Malloy having a dismal approval rating, in Connecticut, Republicans in races outside of the race for governor in that state are really struggling. The Democrats running for races in Connecticut, House and Senate, are actually sending money outside of Connecticut to fund more competitive races, including some in California. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the governor's race in Connecticut. But I think the lack of other competitive races might hurt voter enthusiasm on the Republican side, which is similar in California. I think a lot of people thought that the gas tax ballot initiative might increase turnout, and it might. We'll have to see. But there's a lack of competitive statewide races that might hurt GOP enthusiasm and turnout.
If I may jump back for a moment to the media question and the Beto O'Rourke, I find it fascinating that he is being, as you say, he looks like a Kennedy and he has this youthful charm about him, which the media just will not shut up about. But does anybody know how old he is and compared to Ted Cruz? I think it would shock most people to find out that they're a year apart. Cruz is 1 year older.
I just heard that. I thought he was about 10 years younger.
Yeah. And give him credit, I suppose he does look younger. But does that make somebody a better candidate and make them a better senator? I mean, if that's what you're basing it on, you're missing a point.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Beto O'Rourke is someone we'd probably want to have over for a barbecue and have a beer with, and Ted Cruz is someone we probably wouldn't want to hang out with, but is a pretty good senator.
So turning to the ballot measures, let's start with the one that probably affects most Californians, Prop 6. That's repeal of the gas and diesel tax that was enacted back in 2017. So for background, gas taxes increased by 12 cents a gallon, while the diesel tax increased by 20 cents. So Prop 6 would not only repeal these taxes, but what I like most about Prop 6 is that Californians would get to vote on any future fuel tax hike. But there's some controversy in this campaign. Adding insult to injury. Carrie, you wrote in a blog that Caltrans may be playing fast and loose with taxpayer dollars and that Caltrans may be using funds to oppose Prop 6. Tell us about that and if you think Prop 6 will pass.
Sorry, the Caltrans workers, they found some roadside workers, and rather than actually performing their duties on the road, maintenance and repair, they were actually stopping cars and handing out flyers in opposition to Proposition 6. I suppose they were going to tell the drivers, we're not going to be able to finish fixing this road if you vote to repeal, to give the gas tax. So that should be pretty infuriating to have. And where's the money coming from? It's coming from the fuel tax, the motor fuel tax that we pay, to pay these fellows out there to campaign on the side of the road or in the middle of the road, stop traffic. I think if I had seen that happen with myself, I would be pretty upset. And I think most people would be, no matter where they come down, either way, what party they affiliate with or associate themselves with. But I think a lot of us thought that this repeal would pass, but now we're looking at polling, and it doesn't look that good. It looks like it's going to be turned down by the voters. But even if it did pass, even if it was repealed, there's still another more gas price fuel taxes on the way. By 2030, it could be as much as 36 cents a gallon additional for gasoline and 44 cents for diesel. And of course, these are going to be increases that suppose they're going to fight climate change. But then, of course, it's not going to do a thing but raise the price of gasoline, especially. And these, of course, this hurts the poorest among us. As always, these things happen when taxes get raised on consumer items.
Prop 6 is one of those issues where it's kind of confusing for voters, actually, and that may be fueling the high no vote for the proposition. In the October 24th PPIC poll, it showed that it was trailing by about 7%. But if you want to repeal the gas tax increase, you have to vote yes. And I wrote a blog about this phenomenon where are people being confused by this? Are they saying they're no on 6, meaning they're no on the gas tax? And actually, some of the polling has borne this out, that if you just simply asked, are you in favor of repealing the gas tax increase, most Californians are in favor of repealing the gas tax increase. So it's clever on the part of the Attorney General and Secretary of State who kind of game these propositions in just the setup on the ballot and the title and summary. So it will be interesting to see if the Yes campaign can break through that fog and get Californians who are inclined to repeal the gas tax to actually vote yes on Prop 6.
Well, maybe we'll have a repeat of the 2000 recount where we can look at hanging chads and look at ballots and see if we can divine what somebody intended rather than what they actually voted for.
Yeah, so another measure that PRI has been closely watching is Prop 10, which allows local governments to enact rent control on housing. So this repeals the Costa-Hawkins Housing Act, which prohibits local governments from passing rent control laws. Carrie, you're the author of a very popular study that PRI published, Unaffordable, on the state's housing crisis. Talk about Prop 10 and why you think it will further exacerbate the housing crisis.
Well, once again, we have an issue where the lack of understanding of economics creates big problems. It's been shown over and over again that rent control restricts the supply of housing. And what California needs more than anything to make housing more affordable is to increase its supply. This is a point most economists agree on, even economists on the political left. This is not something that's just a right-wing way of looking at things. It looks like this proposition is going to fail. That doesn't mean the housing crisis is going to improve immediately or even over time because of that, but at least it won't get worse, which would certainly happen if Prop 10 passed.
So while the gas tax and rent control propositions are probably the two most important measures from PRI's perspective, there are about 10 other statewide propositions. As free marketeers, we like direct democracy, but there are some propositions that probably have most Californians mystified as to why they're being asked to weigh in. Tim, you mentioned several of them in your blog. Talk about a few.
Well, Ro, there really are some far-out initiatives this election, and it proves that if you have a couple of $1 million, you can put anything on the ballot. One of these measures, Proposition 7, would give the legislature the ability to change California's observance of daylight savings time. Now, the legislature actually put this one on the ballot, and it begs the question, why? Is this really a priority? Why are lawmakers wasting time debating this measure instead of solving our massive housing crisis or alleviating our poverty problem? Then there's another measure, Proposition 11, that would let private ambulance companies continue their current practice of having EMTs and paramedics stay on duty during meal and rest breaks so that they can respond to 911 calls. Well, of course, that's just plain common sense, but couldn't the legislature enact such a law? This is something that everyone should be able to agree with. And finally, we have something that, Ro, you've written about on Right by the Bay, which is Proposition 8, and that is on track to be the most expensive ballot battle this year. And it's really a political stunt by unions to try and get dialysis clinic workers to join their union. And they're doing so by pushing a measure that would mandate private dialysis clinics spend a certain amount of money on outpatient care. And by spending money, that means hiring more nurses and increasing salaries for nurses. So, that measure really leaves a bad taste in everyone's mouth. So now some of these crazy measures may make you question whether we should reform or even scrap the initiative process. I say no. The initiative process is the only way people can end the status quo in Sacramento. It's so sacred, really, for our democracy that we have to accept these warts to preserve the people's right to change the course of the state at the ballot box.
Yes, I would agree with that. But you would think that, say, the gas tax, which I've got to believe, haven't seen the polls lately, that most people didn't want to see that happen. And yet it looks like that, proposition might go down. So it's unfortunate that the direct democracy may not work in this case, thanks to probably some shenanigans in the way it's presented on the ballot. So, now, Ben, we've been saving Prop 12 for you. Prop 12 establishes new standards for confining farm animals on what we like to call the caged chicken proposition. So in your blog, you call this a measure that actually pits the left against the left. So tell us about that.
Sure. Well, this has been something that's been personally fascinating for me to write about. And going back to Tim's point, I think the whole referendum process in this state is where you do see a difference between states like Connecticut and California. So a bit about Prop 12. This is a Humane Society-backed initiative that would establish some new minimum cage size requirements for egg-laying hens, pigs, and calves raised for veal on California farms. And what it would essentially do is update Proposition 2, which, as some listeners might remember, was passed in 2008 and followed up by a state bill that set standards for farm animal containment, but it didn't specify requirements for cage sizes. And what's interesting is that you have opponents of this initiative claiming that it does not go far enough to protect animals. And organizations like PETA and the Humane Farming Association are accusing the Humane Society of colluding with the United Egg Producers, which is the egg industry's largest trade association. It's a national group to create this initiative, and they allege that it's friendly to the industry and to producers. So it's hard to tell in California where actual producers stand on the issue. I think their voices have sort of been drowned out, but they probably can't be happy with having to potentially comply and invest in new caging requirements after being forced to comply with Prop 2's requirements after it was passed in 2008. And one thing that I think, as Carrie mentioned with Prop 6, has been lost in this debate is the disproportionate negative impact that these types of regulations have on low-income families who can least afford to pay a premium for eggs. We've seen that Proposition 2 increased egg prices, and while it's great to have choice as a consumer to be able to purchase cage-free eggs, I think it would be much better for consumers and producers alike if the market advanced the trend towards cage-free, not the government. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in November.
Have you seen the polls on this one yet?
I haven't seen any polling actually on this. I don't know if they've done it, but I'm sure there must be some internal polling done by the Humane Society.
So guys, let's handicap the races. On the top of the ticket is Democrat Gavin Newsom and Republican John Cox. While it's pretty clear that Newsom will be the next California governor, it was a surprise to many that Cox made it to the ballot given California's jungle primary where the top two vote getters make it to the general election. What do you think explains John Cox's respectable showing?
To me, it's just going to forever remain a mystery, I think. I wish I knew how he was able to get that second place. And in fact, this might be possible he could, I think this would be a big victory for the Republican Party in the state. He may not lose by, his loss may only be in single digits. So you look at that, and it would be a big plus for the GOP. I think maybe to look at this, maybe the simple answer is, and sometimes the simple answer is the best answer, it's just the other Democrats were just weak candidates. Nobody wanted them at all, and then so they chose Cox.
It would definitely be a moral victory for the GOP if he only lost by 11 points, as the October 24th PPIC poll shows. However, that same poll also shows that Democrats are much more enthusiastic about voting in California than Republicans and independents. So that probably is not a feather in Mr. Cox's cap. But, going back to the question about how did he get here, well, Mr. Cox had one thing going for him in the primary, and that was he was competing against Travis Allen for the hearts and minds of Republican voters. And for those of you who don't know Travis Allen, he's a state assemblyman leaving office this year. It also doesn't hurt that my old boss, House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and other statewide Republicans really felt that a Republican was needed in the top two for governor to boost Republican turnout in the general election and save some of these embattled congressional races. So they also helped and endorsed Mr. Cox to get him through to the November election.
I would just add quickly that, Tim, you had mentioned the PPIC poll. That poll also shows that Cox has a 5-point lead among independents in California, which I think could be a good thing for Republicans in the state where voter registration is pretty bleak. And the outlook, I think, for the party is not looking so good. So I guess that's one silver lining, perhaps, in this race.
So in the senatorial race, Dianne Feinstein is a favorite over Kevin DeLeon. But one wonders how close this race will be. Republicans and independents who were willing to vote for Feinstein to stop a far-left candidate like Kevin DeLeon might withhold their vote given her bungling in the Kavanaugh's hearings. Do you think that the political damage will further weaken her stature in the party?
I don't think it's done that much damage, and I have to think this is the last time she's going to run, so she's not going to care if there's a little bit of damage going forth. Last I saw, she had a pretty good double-digit lead, although I also saw there was a large group of, or a large chunk of people who were polled that said they are not going to vote in this race. I think part of it, too, is a lot of Democrats have been comfortable with her for a long time, and maybe we can call them establishment Democrats, not quite ready to ride on the progressive edge with De Leon. So I think maybe that there's a little bit of comfort that she's been around so long that they're okay with her for at least for one more 6-year term.
Yeah, I think you're right, Carrie, that this is really a battle between the mainstream left and the extreme progressive left. And the extreme progressive left and the Democratic Socialists are very strong in places like party conventions where they were able to deny Feinstein the endorsement over De Leon. Now, Ro, on your observation about Republicans and independents, I think most Republicans will skip the race. We saw in the October 24th PPIC poll that there's some evidence of this. 23% of voters say they won't vote, and I think most of those are Republican voters. It's also kind of wild to see that Kevin De Leon is leading in only one group in the PPIC poll, and that's among Republicans. And that's not really any endorsement of him. It's an anti-Feinstein sentiment. If those Republicans knew that De Leon was perhaps the most far-left Senate pro tem we've had in California history, and that he's been in the center of a lot of Me Too and corruption scandals in Sacramento, they would desert him in a heartbeat. So I agree with Carrie that De Leon is going to lose badly on Election Day. Feinstein will be comfortably reelected.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think Feinstein probably would have been more vulnerable against another opponent with perhaps the ability to raise more money nationally with more of a national profile. I think she must recognize that her being more of a moderate on a lot of policy positions puts her at odds with the direction of the party in general in this state. I don't think that we've seen the last of De Leon. I think he might eventually run for city council and potentially even mayor of the city of Los Angeles at some point. So it'll be interesting to see what his political future holds.
Let's turn to the House. Most pundits believe that the House is going to flip to the Democrat. Of the 60-some seats at risk at the House, about half a dozen or so are here in California. So let's go through them. California District 10 in Turlock, Jeff Denham versus Josh Harder. Tim, you want to take that?
Yeah, well, the PPIC poll did have some good news for Republicans running for these very competitive races. It showed that they're leading by 5 points in these 11 most competitive districts. But, as we said, the Democratic enthusiasm is much more pronounced than it is among Republican voters. Now, that could really hurt an incumbent like Jeff Denham. Despite the millions the Democrats have spent against him as a Trump acolyte, Denham is actually a pretty moderate and cautious politician, and he represents his district well. He's been outspoken in pushing for immigration reform, and he really scored a major victory when President Trump just signed the executive order that will hopefully free up more water for farmers in his district. The Democrat, Josh Harder, is a young venture capitalist who grew up in the district, but has been living most of the past years in San Francisco, and he came home just to run for Congress. He and his allies have spent something like $10 million against Denham in the campaign. The latest New York Times poll showed that it's working. Harder is ahead by 6 points among likely voters. There's no question that Denham is in the fight of his political life, but I think this district is more conservative than the polls are showing, and I think it could actually be a very close race in November.
Do you think Denham will prevail?
I'm not willing to bet money either way.
Okay. How about California 25 in Palmdale, Stephen Knight versus Katie Hill?
Well, I've had the pleasure or misfortune, depending on how you look at it, of having to spend a week in past elections campaigning in Lancaster and Palmdale, and it's definitely not somewhere you'd want to go on vacation, but it's been a political battleground in recent years, and that's because it's a former Republican stronghold, but it's a politically changing area. Now, Steve Knight, who's been in the state assembly and the state senate, he's always been seen as an underdog. He's always been a target for Democrat, and he has kind of a reputation as not being the strongest fundraiser, but he's always defied the odds and come through in the end. And I might actually bet money on him, in this case. The Democrat is Katie Hill, and she ran a homeless nonprofit in the area before running for office, and she's outspent Knight significantly, something like 5-1. And we saw that Michael Bloomberg just dropped $4 million in this race, and all altogether, there's been about $15 million in outside spending in the race, and much of it against Knight. Now, despite all this, the polling shows that the race is pretty close. The most recent New York Times poll showed that Knight was 2 points ahead, and there was a recent UC Berkeley poll that showed Hill narrowly ahead. So this is a case where the Kavanaugh bump might actually help Steve Knight. The Hill campaign told reporters that she was starting to pull away in her polling, but then Knight got a big boost in the polls after the Kavanaugh confirmation. So we'll see, but I would say that if anyone can survive a big money hit, it's Steve Knight.
So let's move on to California District 39 in Fullerton. That would be Gil Cisneros versus Young Kim, and that's Ed Royce's old seat. Carrie, do you want to take that one?
That one is close, very tight. The most recent polling came out of Siena College. New York Times has Cisneros up by 1.1 percentage points. If you look at the 538 website, they have a chance of winning. They have Cisneros at 57.7%, Young Kim at 42.3%. But there's been a lot of scissor action back and forth going back for some time of who had the best chance of winning. And it keeps flipping and flopping back and forth. I think what's going to happen here, whichever candidate finishes the strongest, has the strongest close, is going to win this one. If Cisneros wins, this has been a Republican stronghold for so long. If he wins, then that's going to be a bad sign for the GOP in the state, which contradicts what I was saying about John Cox. If he has even a single-digit loss, that's actually promising for the GOP in the state. But this has been, for so long, has been in the hands of Republicans. If it even goes by 1 percentage point to the Democrat, I think there's going to have to be some hard looking at what the Republican Party does in this state and how it conducts its business going forward.
District 45, that's Irvine with Mimi Walters and Katie Porter. Ben, you're going to take this one?
This is another part of the state where Republicans have traditionally been very strong and often serve forever, it seems. As listeners to this podcast will know, Hillary Clinton won Orange County in this district in 2016. All of the polls show that this race will be pretty close. Walters is under heavy attack by Katie Porter for supporting most of President Trump's policies. Porter, if you don't know, she's a protege of Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, and she supports Medicare for all and a lot of progressive policies. David Min, who is the more moderate Democrat, lost to Porter in the primary, and I wonder if Democrats down there think that if they elected him through the primary system, that he might have been able to do a better job up against Mimi Walters. So I hate to make any predictions because I think the race will be pretty close in the end.
District 48, Costa Mesa, that's Dana Rohrabacher versus Harley Ruda. Now, I'm going to take this one because Dana Rohrabacher is an old friend of mine back in our speechwriting days from Reagan administration. Real Clear right now has him as a toss-up, but Rasmussen has given Dana the edge. Last time I looked, the ads against Dana are probably the kookiest I've ever seen in this campaign season. It's got the spaceman kind of floating out in the air and saying that Dana is too far out. I'm assuming that refers to his Putin connection, but I have to say, knowing Dana back in the day, he was one of the fiercest anti-communists. So I think that's a stretch to say that he's buddies with Putin. It's true that the demographics in Orange County are changing, but he was in a tough race in 2016 and he pulled it off. So I think that he'll pull it off again. How about District 49? This Mike Levin and Diane Harkey. Ben, you're taking this one? This is Darrell Ice's old seat.
That's right. The 49th district includes northern San Diego counties, coastal cities, as well as Camp Pendleton and parts of southern Orange County. And I think it's arguably one of the most watched and high-profile elections going on in the country this year. There's a Flip the 49th group that's been working pretty aggressively since 2016 to get out the vote and increase Democratic voter registration. And I'm not sure whether they've been able to really close the gap down there, but I think the challenge for Levin has been to appeal to more moderate voters, which seems to go against his bringing Bernie Sanders to a recent campaign rally just days before the election. Unlike other candidates also running in competitive districts in the state and in others, he's also been publicly supportive of Nancy Pelosi, which is another risky proposition, I think, for more moderate and independent voters trying to attract them. He's currently ahead in the latest New York Times poll against Harkey, and I think it's possible that they've done some internal polling by his campaign that shows that bringing Sanders and embracing Pelosi might work to his advantage, but I think it'll be very close in the end as well.
So, Tim, you've been following the legislative seats, the Assembly and the Senate. What you're finding there, how about starting with Catherine Baker in the East Bay? Valley, PRI's backyard. How's she doing?
Democrats are certainly spending big against her. She is the lone Republican in the legislature anywhere in the Bay Area, and so she always has a target on her back. And this year is no exception. They're spending a lot of money against her, but she's pretty well funded and has some deep-pocketed allies on her behalf. Certainly, Republicans are pulling out all the stops to try and reelect her. I would be very surprised. That could be one where turnout plays a factor. If Democrats are more enthusiastic, despite her bipartisan appeal, that's not helpful for her, if there's a massive Democratic turnout edge. But I'd be very surprised if she was not reelected.
Any other races you're watching?
So in the Senate, there's really just one battle, and that's the Central Valley seat that's held by retiring Senator Anthony Cannella. Democratic Assemblywoman Anna Caballero, who lost a Senate race here 8 years ago, is running against Madera County Supervisor Rob Poitras. Both parties are spending millions here, and if the Democrats win, they will take back a supermajority in the Senate. The Assembly is already starting down 2 Republican seats. They lost a Republican seat in San Diego County when 2 Democrats advanced to the general election in what's now Assemblyman Rocky Chavez's seat. And the GOP has all but conceded the San Bernardino seat of retiring Assemblyman Mark Steinort. So the real battles are in Riverside, where former federal prosecutor Bill Asaley is running a very strong campaign against one-term incumbent Sabrina Cervantes. Now, this is a former Republican Assembly seat. She voted for the gas tax increase, and that's been an albatross around her neck. So that'll be a test of the potency of that as an issue. Another toss-up is Kern County, where Justin Mendes, who's a city councilman and David Valadeo staffer, he's running a strong race against Assemblyman Rudy Salas. That's a part of the state, a rare part, where just being a Democrat is hurting Salas. This is a place where Gavin Newsom and National Democrats are very unpopular. So I think Salas will be a tough incumbent to beat, but he's definitely in the fight of his life. Democrats are also spending big in these areas where there are hot congressional races. So they're spending big against Matthew Harper in Orange County, and he too is in the fight of his political life. And that's a seat where I'd say he should be reelected, but it's one to watch for an upset on election night. Another upset watch could be the seat that's being vacated by Travis Allen, also in Orange County. Tyler Deep is a Vietnamese American Republican, and he's running a strong race. He's running against Josh Lowenthal, who's the son of the congressman, Alan Lowenthal. And he also made a fortune by starting freeconferencecall.com. So that's another one to watch for an upset. Last overlap race, it's Assemblyman Dante Acosta in Santa Clarita. That's in the Knight congressional seat, and he's being significantly outspent by his challenger, Christy Smith. And this is actually a rematch of the 2016 race where Acosta won narrowly. So it's a very real propositions that Republicans could find themselves at 21 or 22 seats in the Assembly after the elections.
To cap this off, let's take a poll. Will the GOP keep the Senate, or will the Dems take the House? So let's start with Ben.
I predict Dems will take the House, and the Republicans will probably keep the Senate. Under that scenario, I would imagine that Trump will win in 2020, because I think Democrats will probably focus on impeachment and other issues and just annoy everybody. So,
how about you, Kerry?
I'm going to go on record as saying I think the blue wave is just going to wind up being a media wish that isn't going to happen. I think it's probably going to end up being more of a ripple in which the Democrats make some progress, but I don't think they're going to take the House or the Senate. I base part of this on going back to 2016. At this point in 2016, how many people, and especially the experts, thought that Donald Trump would be the next president? Probably none. I just look like this is happening again. I think polling is becoming less reliable because I think people are just telling the pollsters quite often what they think the pollsters want to hear, and then they go to the ballot box and do something different. I'm betting they're going to be wrong again, and even though the Democrats will make some inroads, that they're not going to take either of the chambers in Congress.
Well, I say the Republicans will keep the Senate and will gain seats in the Senate. And I think the Democrats will take the House, but it will be a lot narrower margin and will be up a lot later on election night than most people think. You know, I saw Kevin McCarthy speak at the PPIC lunch in Sacramento earlier this year, and they asked him about that. And he said, if you look at the national poll, the generic ballot between Democrats and Republicans, that Republicans start down 3 or 4 points because of redistricting and how that national vote is distributed. So right now, the generic ballot, it's narrowed a bit to about 8 or 9 points in most polls, and it had been, 12, 13 points in a lot of polls up to now. Well, if that's the case, then that means Democrats are only 3 or maybe 4 points ahead on the generic ballot. So that being the case, they can be expected to gain some seats and potentially enough to take the majority. It's only 25 seats, but it's not going to be the runaway that our friends in the media have been forecasting.
I'm going to be a contrarian and agree with Carrie. I think that clearly it's looking now that the GOP will keep the Senate, but I think the House is going to squeak by with maybe 8 to 10 advantage seats over the Democrats. I like Carrie. I agree that the polls aren't as reliable as they used to be, and they didn't work in 2016. So I'm betting that we'll see some surprises in 2018. So finally, guys, our favorite question: what adult beverage will you be drinking as you watch the returns Tuesday night?
For me, hopefully it's just going to be bottled water, but I may open a red eventually. I may eventually open a red that I found on the clearance rack at Bevmo. We'll see.
Well, I always have lots of nervous energy on election day, so I'll probably need a stiff drink or two to calm me down throughout the night. So I think I'm going to enjoy a Grey Goose vodka and tonic on the rocks with a lime.
That sounds good, Tim. A friend of mine just gifted me a bottle of Duckhorn Merlot, which I think is probably one of the finest Merlots produced up in Napa. So I think I'll be enjoying that. They're not a sponsor, but they could be.
Alone? You can't drink an entire bottle, so you shouldn't.
Yeah. Now, I'm actually going to be in San Francisco election eve, so I will probably be with some of my independent and liberal friends. So I too am going to need a stiff drink. I favor vodka martinis for Tuesday night. So, guys, in the final words of John McLaughlin, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I don't know if we pulled that off very well, but it's the spirit that counts. So for Ben Smithwick, Carrie Jackson, and Tim Anaya, thanks for joining us. And don't forget to join us again post-election to see who is the best pundit and who has to go back to their think tank day job. We'd like to invite all our listeners to PRI's annual Sir Anthony Fisher Gala in San Francisco on Saturday, November 10th. Our keynote speaker is none other than the author and media commentator Mark Stein. So for more details, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell all your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchan. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.